No, you can't come in. We don't want any. Oh.
You can supply it separately.
Did we get to President Adams yet?
We talked about it.
No, I mean, has he been did we get to his election?
I think we got to like the election of 1800.
Okay, good. I thought I had it in line. There you go. I wasn't watching you out. Let's see who we have and don't have today. I don't see Post. Turn on your lights, Post. They're saving electricity. Maybe I talked about why I called the election of 1800 the Second American Revolution. Did I mention that? Or I said I was going to explain that? That's kind of causes me to remember a little bit.
And you also said that John Adams still had stuff to do
Before he left.
Yeah.
Okay, and we didn't talk about that yet. Okay. So that's where we're going to pick up. Hale Center, I noticed this morning, only this morning, that they didn't record Monday's class for you guys to watch. So I sent you a link so that you can watch the 10 o'clock Monday class and catch up with us. You really need to do that. Goodness gracious, this light on here is messed up. Looks a little bit better. It's looking like the abominable snowman. So that's where we're going to pick up. We'll see how far we get with the Thomas Jefferson presidency, but Adams' presidency is not actually over after Thomas Jefferson gets elected, and I think I threw that question at you, maybe, because I tend to do that. Jefferson's elected in November after some playing around, after 35 ballots in the House of Representatives to break the tie between Jefferson and Burr. Jefferson kind of marginalizes Burr a little bit once the election's over. He's civil to Burr. They're polite to one another, but he really doesn't give Burr much to do. And Burr is kind of an interesting mystery. I'm going to look for something. See if I can find it for you about Aaron Burr. And then I'll put it up for you. I've got to find it first. I'll put it in notes and readings for you. If I can find it, that is. There it is. I knew I did it. There's a quiz up. I put another quiz up. And I put a little thing about historical context. And I said in this paper, in the terms of history, context means the circumstances that form the setting for an event. In other words, what's going on at the time something happens helps you understand what the event is. A statement or idea in terms of which you can fully understand the event and assess it. And we'll look at that. We'll look at that a little bit later when Burr begins to have his problems, although he's already having them even when he first becomes vice president. And he certainly gets a bum rap when you watch things like Hamilton and all that. They make him look like a bad guy in Hamilton.
A little bit.
Yeah. So let's talk about those last few months of Adams. One of the sad things for Adams, one of the reasons he wasn't popular, or he didn't get elected, I think, was because he couldn't solve the problem with the French. He couldn't solve the problem that the quasi-war with the French. And another problem he had was that the Federalists were kind of fading away, and everybody was aware of it, and the Federalists were feeling very defensive about it. And the irony for Adams is, after the election's over with, and after he fails to get reelected, he solves the problem with the French. He fires the Secretary of State, who was useless, a guy named Timothy Pickering. He fires the Secretary of War, who decides, I'm going to take control of things a little bit more firmly. He sends a man named William Vans Murray and says, talk to whoever's running things over there. And it wasn't really totally clear who was in charge in France. And William Vans Murray gets all the way to Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte's very, very busy consolidating power. He's taking over in France. He's a man of great ambition and great ability, too, as far as that goes. But he's busy. And he wants to know what Mr. Murray wants, and Mr. Murray says, your ships are attacking our cargo ships, causing us great losses. We're supposed to be friends, at least, although we're staying neutral in this war. Can't you do something about that? And Napoleon basically says, okay, I'll deal with it. And he does. And they stop taking our ships. And Murray reports back to Adams, great news, except as far as politicians are concerned, it does Adams no good because the election's already over. Kind of ironic. Adams did things not for a political reason, but he did things because he thought they were right. I'm trying to pull up a set of slides called Republican Republic. See if I can get them to come up on the machine here, so everything works. Yeah, there you go, the last days of Adams. I mean, he didn't die or anything. He was just out of office. We tend to kind of forget the presidents after they're gone. He was a lame duck Federalist with a Democratic Republican president waiting in the wings, waiting to come on the stage. That's a slide that talks about William Vans Murray cooling the tensions with the French. We talked about the election already. I don't think we talked about the midnight judges, though. It's the beginning of 1801. So it's already after the election. Adams is still president. He's going to be president until the 4th day of March. That's when our presidents were inaugurated, up until the 1900s. Adams is looking for something to do for his Federalist friends because they're all going to be out of the executive branch. They were probably also going to be out of the legislative branch, or at least in a minority. And so Adams and the Federalists in Congress come up with an idea, let's give people jobs in the judiciary. The neat thing about the judiciary is, if we give people jobs as federal judges, nobody can fire them. They serve for life. And so they passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. The Judiciary Act of 1801 creates 16 new federal circuit courts with federalist judges for each court, additional attorneys, clerks, marshals. And while he's doing that, he appoints Virginia Federalist John Marshall to be Chief Justice of the United States and establishes 42 justices of the peace for Washington, D.C., for the District of Columbia. Thomas Jefferson is not happy about this, but he can't do anything about it because he's not president yet. He says, the Federalists have retired into the judiciary as a stronghold. He's going to try and deal with it when he becomes president. But that's called the Midnight Judges. Now what do we have? Well, we have a country within 10 years we'll have 7.2 million people in the country. It's going to grow from 5.2 million to 7.2 in the 10 years or so of the first Democratic Republicans in office, being Jefferson and the beginning of Madison's presidency. 20% of the population are slaves from Africa. Children under 16 are the largest group in our population. Apparently we're reproducing rather quickly. People identify not with the country as a whole, but with their own regions. And there's some people who are already threatening to secede from the Union because they're not getting their way. Namely, some Federalists who feel like their importance is fading away. That's what our country looked like. The green was either states or territories. You see the Northwest Territories, Ohio Territory, Indiana Territory. Of course, that's going to be broken down into a number of different states. By 1800, the Louisiana Territory, which went roughly from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains, is going to be back in the hands of the French. Whoops, thought that belonged to Spain. Well, Napoleon leaned on the Spanish. He's about to take over Spain. He leaned on the Spanish and persuaded them to sell the Louisiana Territory to him, including New Orleans. A little bit later on, that's going to worry us. But for the time being, Spain doesn't move into the Louisiana Territory, and there's not many people in the Louisiana Territory to start with. France is not there, Spain's not there really in any big numbers except New Orleans. Way out west, there's another territory called Oregon Country, claimed by Spain, claimed by the United States, claimed by Britain. On this map, it doesn't mention somebody else that claims it too, and that's the Russians. Because you see, the Russians, if you extended this map a little bit, you'd see that the far eastern part of Russia is very, very close to what we call Alaska now, and to the northwest. Remember, that's where that theoretical land bridge was supposed to be that the American Indians crossed over to get on to North and South America. New Spain extended all the way up to about 42 degrees north latitude, but the Spanish weren't really in any great numbers along the west coast of North America. Maybe somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people. That's a big, big territory. 5,000 or 8,000 people disappear in it. And down where, in the area that we call Texas now, probably less than 1,500 people of European origin. So that wasn't particularly settled at all, but it was claimed. So, this is what Thomas Jefferson's gonna have to work with. By the way, our agriculture is still the main form of income. Shipping's starting to build up, but we're having a little trouble because of the French issues. Most of our big cities are seaports associated with international trade. Otherwise, big cities just don't play an important part in our country. The South doesn't have any big cities. The biggest cities in the South, Charleston, and it had, if they're lucky, 20,000 people in it. We're just beginning to look at industrialization and that sort of thing. Okay. Background of Thomas Jefferson, lawyer, served in the House of Burgesses, architect, engineer, inventor. He designed his own house. Declaration of Independence, he wrote most of it. He's one of the people that founded the University of Virginia. He'd been our ambassador to France. He'd been our first Secretary of State, that was under George Washington until he quit in 1793. He'd been Vice President under John Adams. It's a funny thing because John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were pretty much friends until John Adams became president, and then their friendship started to fade really quickly because they had widely divergent points of view as far as politics were concerned. I think Thomas Jefferson understood politics better than John Adams did. John Adams was just an earnest, hardworking person who did his best and tried to maintain the dignity of the office of president. Thomas Jefferson wasn't big on dignity. He didn't like dressing up. He didn't like speaking in front of Congress. He was eloquent when he wrote. When he spoke, he was uncomfortable. He didn't have a really great speaking voice. This is some of his cabinet members. Secretary of State will be his protege, James Madison. Both of them studied under the same law professors. His first vice president will be Aaron Burr. His second term of office, it will be George Clinton, the pretty old governor of New York. Also the father-in-law of Citizen Genet. Remember old Citizen Genet? Secretary of Treasury Samuel Dexter is going to kick off before he really serves as Secretary of the Treasury. And Albert Gallatin, a man born in Switzerland, is going to take over the job, which was probably a good thing for America. Secretary of War is a fellow named Henry Dearborn. We'll hear about him again when we talk about the War of 1812. The guy right in the middle of that picture is Albert Gallatin. Looks a little bit like Yoda to me. Really, really smart man. As secretaries of Treasury go, he was in office longer than any Secretary of Treasury in the history of the United States. He held the office for 13 years. There's James Madison. We called him the father of the Constitution, key author of the Bill of Rights. He was an anti-federalist, even though he believed in the need for a constitution. He contributed to the Federalist Papers, strangely enough, even though he was an anti-federalist. He participated in the Compromise of 1790 that set up the Capitol down on the Potomac River, across from Alexandria, Virginia, and adjacent to Maryland. He was one of the authors of the Virginia Resolves. He was the party that was sued in Marbury versus Madison. We'll talk about that. Participated in the Louisiana Purchase, we'll talk about that. And eventually he's going to become the 4th president of the United States, and we'll talk about that. Governor James Monroe of Virginia fought in the Revolutionary War, was our ambassador to France in between 1794 and 1796. Washington fired him because he got too friendly with the French, and Washington didn't think he was firm enough with the French. The French loved him, by the way. He's a good friend of Thomas Paine, the guy that wrote Common Sense and the Crisis. He's a good friend of the Marquis de Lafayette. Served twice as governor of Virginia. And he's eventually going to become Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and then the 5th President of the United States. So what you're seeing is a whole lot of pretty lofty people who are going even higher. But he's working for Jefferson. We'll talk about him later. Meriwether Lewis, he's Jefferson's, I guess you call him a personal secretary back then. I think you call him his chief of staff now. As a young lieutenant, he'd gone to help put down the Whiskey Rebellion, along with General Morgan. He's the guy that's going to plan out the big expedition all the way to the Pacific, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Robert Livingston, a New Yorker, one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence, along with Thomas Jefferson, was our Secretary of Foreign Affairs before we had a Secretary of State, before we had a Constitution. He's the man that administered the presidential oath to George Washington when he first took office. Our ambassador to France at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, what's Jefferson like? He wanted America to be a land of small landholders. Everybody'd have a piece of the action. He didn't like big cities. He didn't like crowds. It's kind of funny because he didn't like big concentrations of people, and yet he believed in things like industry. That's kind of a dichotomy. How can you have industry if you don't have a concentration of people? He was afraid of international entanglement, and yet he got involved in it all the time. He was very interested in Western lands, even though we didn't own them all, out west of the Mississippi, because he believed everyone should have a piece of land. And yet he didn't believe that presidents could do things that weren't specifically given to them as duties under the Constitution. He wanted to have a minimal, frugal government, and he's going to do away with our armed forces pretty much. And yet, he's going to get involved in conflicts. He's opposed to slavery, and yet he owns slaves. That's a little bit confusing, isn't it? Yeah. You got kind of a split personality there. He didn't like ceremonies, he didn't like formality, he didn't like dressing up. If you knocked on the front door of his house, and people actually could back then, can you imagine trying to knock on the president's front door now? He might show up at the front door wearing his slippers, a robe with long, tangled up red hair hanging down on his shoulders. He didn't believe in wearing wigs either. But he understood politics, and he knew that somehow or other success would depend on his cooperation with Congress. And he worked hard at that, even though he didn't like standing up and speaking before them. So he wrote a lot of things to Congress. Right off the bat, let's talk about domestic issues. First of all, he's thinking, when I get to be president, I'm doing away with the national bank. I don't like the idea of a national bank. Remember, he argued against the national bank when he argued with Hamilton and kind of lost the fight. So now he's thinking, I'm going to get rid of it. But Albert Gallatin goes to him and says, Mr. President, I really wish you wouldn't do that. If this country is to develop, we need a stable currency, we need a stable economy, and we can't achieve that without a national bank. And give Thomas Jefferson credit for this. He listened to people who knew what they were talking about, and he was smart enough to figure out who knew what they were talking about. And so he followed Gallatin's advice, and he kept his hands off the national bank. That doesn't mean he didn't go after the courts. He was really angry that John Adams had stuck all the Federalists in all the federal courts. He couldn't get rid of the Chief Justice because the Chief Justice was there for life. But he got Congress to pass in 1802 another Judiciary Act, repealing the Judiciary Act of 1801. So they're doing away with all those extra circuit courts, but they can't fire the judges because the judges are all judges for life. Kind of a half victory, huh? Glass half full or half empty, depending on how you looked at it. And then his administration gets embroiled in a big court case, and you better remember this one. Put stars next to it, put lines under it, and circles around it. It's called Marbury versus Madison, Madison being the Secretary of State. Mr. Marbury, while Adams was still president, was given a job as Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. In order to actually begin doing that job, he had to get a commission from the president. The president signed it, dropped it off on the desk of the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State never got around to giving it to Mr. Marbury. So when Mr. Madison comes into the office of Secretary of State, there it is on the desk, Mr. Marbury saying, may I have my commission, please? Mr. Madison saying, commission. I haven't seen your commission, but I'll look around for it. And that commission kept finding itself to the bottom of the pile of things on Mr. Madison's desk. He wasn't in a hurry to give that man a commission, considering what they thought about all the Federalists in office. Finally, Mr. Marbury is going to sue. He's going to the Supreme Court to sue the Secretary of State, to ask the Supreme Court, issue a writ of mandamus, ordering the Secretary of State to give me my commission. And the verdict of John Marshall's Supreme Court was very interesting. You'd think, John Marshall was a Federalist, remember? You'd think he would support this Federalist guy demanding his commission. But John Marshall's court said, yes, you're absolutely right, Mr. Marbury, you deserve that commission, it's rightfully yours. But the Supreme Court can't tell the executive branch how to do its business. That's a breach of the separation of powers. We don't have the power to tell the president what to do. So I'm sorry. And the argument is, well, but the Judiciary Act of 1789 says you can do that. And Mr. Marshall's court says the Judiciary Act of 1789, which says that, Section 13 of the Judiciary Act is incorrect because it contradicts the Constitution of the United States. In short, it's unconstitutional, and therefore it is null and void. It is not valid. So Jefferson and Madison win the case, but John Marshall has established a new precedent that the Supreme Court can review federal law and determine its constitutionality. It's called judicial review of federal laws. This is probably the single most important precedent in the history of the Supreme Court because it sets what the main job of the Supreme Court will be from that day to this day. Almost every ruling in the Supreme Court tells you one thing. It's either constitutional or it's not constitutional. That's what they do. They interpret the Constitution. And that court case set that precedent, which has lasted ever since. Probably the most important precedent in the history of the Supreme Court, because it sets the function of the Supreme Court. Jefferson's going to give priority to cutting federal debt. He's cutting federal debt for a reason. He wants to get rid of taxes. He doesn't want to spend any money, so he's going to cut the military back. He likes cutting the military back because most of the Democratic Republicans believe that the military is pro-federalist and represents a threat to the Democratic Republicans. So he's very happy to cut the Army back. On the other hand, he doesn't fire people that are working for the government if they're competent, regardless of whether they're Federalists or Anti-Federalists. He follows Washington's lead in that. A lot of Federalists just quit. Some really ambitious Federalists see the writing on the wall and they switch over to being Democratic Republicans to keep their jobs. There's a lot of people that are angry with Jefferson for speeding up on the courts, even amongst his own Democratic Republicans. I know on the slide here it calls them Republicans. Some people call them Republicans. Some people call them Democratic Republicans. Some people call them Jeffersonians. All the same thing. They are not like the modern Republican Party by any means. They're not really a party. They're a faction. There's going to be some argument over the slave trade. People are watching over on the island of Hispaniola, where the slaves of Haiti rise up and drive the French out. Slaves that can throw out Europeans? My goodness. There's a lot of people in the South that don't want their slaves to hear about this. Just before Jefferson came into office, there was actually a putative slave rebellion. What I mean is, it was planned, but someone leaked information, and so all the people that were planning this rebellion were rounded up and executed after trial. Interesting trial because they couldn't argue for themselves because they weren't people, according to law. It happened in Virginia. It's called Gabriel's Rebellion. It frightened people in the South, and they started making more and more strict laws about how one controlled one's slaves to keep it from happening again. Reform. He's going to retire the federal debt. He's going to repeal the whiskey tax. He's going to repeal other excise taxes. While he's president, Ohio will become the 17th state. The military is almost gone. It's cut back so bad. He says, if we get into a war, it's only going to be a defensive war, and we can use militia for that. We don't need a professional military. The Democratic Republicans feared professional soldiers. He also cuts the Navy back. Remember, when Washington was president, they passed the Naval Act of 1794 to build new frigates. Well, they stopped that. We already got 3 of them, the Constitution, the Constellation, and the United States, right? Yes. But then they stopped. They ran out of money. Before he goes out of office in 1808, we're going to outlaw the international slave trade. Doesn't outlaw slavery, it just means no more importing slaves from Africa. Maybe a little bit later on we'll talk about the significance of that. What difference that actually made. He's going after judges. He's not done with that. Aside from the Judiciary Act, he's going to try to get judges kicked off federal courts. He's going to try and have some of them impeached for different reasons. He will get one federal judge. Where is it? John Pickering, in 1803, is impeached and removed from the bench because he was an alcoholic and he was ever so slightly insane, which is probably a good reason for him not to be a judge. But some Republicans, or Democratic Republicans, are afraid if you go too far with this, we're going to destroy the judiciary. Jefferson kept pushing, though. He was really angry about this. He tried to impeach Federalist Judge Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase was on the Supreme Court. But his own Democratic Republicans in the Senate refused to convict Samuel Chase. We'll get there. We're not there yet, time-wise. What else happened? He passed some amendments, where he got them through Congress, and then got them ratified. I have a slide here, that's the 12th Amendment. Before that, there was an 11th Amendment passed. Remember, the first 10 amendments were the Bill of Rights. The 11th Amendment had to do with whether a private individual could go into another state and sue that state, a state that was not his own. And the 11th Amendment makes that impossible. You have to go about it in a different way. The 12th Amendment tried to fix the problem of electing president and vice president, making them separate ballots. So you couldn't have an incident like you did when Adams was elected and Jefferson became the vice president. That happened in 1804. Now, one of the things that we start seeing is political parties are beginning to develop. We've got factions. They're not really parties the way we understand parties nowadays. They didn't have a chairman or anything like that. There were the Federalists, that was one faction, the Anti-Federalists, who we're starting to call now the Democratic Republicans, and they're starting to look a little bit like a political party. The Federalists had a really extreme wing up in Massachusetts. They called them the Essex Junto. Junto just means a club or a group of people. These are the really hardline Federalists. They supported the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton. They were feeling very, very defensive about the fact that the Federalists were getting weaker and weaker. They're going to get pretty extreme. They're going to ask Alexander Hamilton to become their leader, but he refuses because he thinks they're up to no good. Their leader was Timothy Pickering. You may remember his name. He replaced Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State when Jefferson quit. Or no, actually there was another guy in between them. But he was Secretary of State under Washington, and he was Secretary of State under Adams until Adams fired him. Another leader was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, a fellow named Theo Parsons. They're going to be constantly plotting this and that and the other thing all the way up through the War of 1812. We'll talk about them again. Now, in the Democratic Republicans, we have a group called the Tertium Quids. Actually, that was a pejorative. That was what people that didn't like them called them. It meant the third something or other. When people said, who are these guys? Some wag came up with the Tertium Quids, which is Latin for the third something. That's all it means. They didn't like pragmatists, and Thomas Jefferson was becoming a pragmatist. A pragmatist is basically a person that says, if it works, then let's do it. He's not so worried about ideals, he's worried about if something's practical, if it functions. They're led by John Taylor and John Randolph, both Virginians. Internal issues that we're going to have to deal with. I mentioned two. One of them is kind of international. It's the Barbary Pirates. The other one's the Louisiana Purchase. That's kind of international too. There's the Barbary Pirates map. The northern coast of Africa that faced into all the way over to Egypt, that faced into the Mediterranean, some of it faced out onto the Atlantic, was called the Maghreb. And there were city-states, kind of cities that dominated whole areas. One was Tangier, one was Algiers, one was Tunis, one was Tripoli, one was Derna. Tripoli and Derna are both in the country of Libya now. Pirates coming out of these different city-states were preying on American ships. Why? Well, we didn't have a navy to protect our cargo ships. They didn't mess with the British. They didn't mess with the French. The British and the French actually paid these guys off to leave their ships alone. But if things got really bad, they always had their navy to protect them. But they didn't protect us anymore because we didn't belong to England anymore. Eventually, the Pasha of Tripoli is demanding more and more money from the Americans, and we don't have money to pay him. We don't have the amount of money that he wanted. He walks into the American consulate in Tripoli and cuts down the American flag as an insult to us. Eventually, and it takes us a while to kind of wind ourselves up because we really don't have much of a navy. We've got a few frigates left over from the American Revolution, and we've got a few of those new ones that are still getting finished. USS Philadelphia goes over there late in 1803 and starts chasing some of these pirates around. Ran aground right outside of Tripoli on a reef. Couldn't get the ship off the reef. They tried everything. They tried rocking it. They tried pulling it off of the boat. Nothing worked. And the pirates rowed out to the ship, and they took over the ship. There was nothing the sailors could do. They were outnumbered, overwhelmed. They held the sailors and officers prisoners for ransom. Eventually, we were going to pay the ransom, $600,000 worth. But they've got our ship. Early in 1804, the Commodore is just a senior captain who has a few ships under his command, by the name of Preble, sails into the Mediterranean, and a young lieutenant volunteers, a young Navy lieutenant volunteers, and he gets a crew of men who are willing to risk everything, and they actually go into Tripoli harbor, where the American ship has been floated off the reef, and now it's in the harbor, and the Tripolitans are trying to fix it up so they can use it themselves. And these American sailors board the ship, chase the guards off of the ship, and burn the ship, set it on fire, so that the pirates can't be using their ship, an American ship. Now a little bit later, come on slides, move along. A fellow by the name of William Eaton, he's in the middle of this slide. On the right-hand side is Stephen Decatur. William Eaton comes up with an idea. He explains to the Department of State, to the President, that the Pasha of Tripoli is actually not is the younger brother of the guy that should be the Pasha, but he chased his older brother out of town. Yusuf Karamanli is his name. He's the one that's demanding all the money. Out in the desert is Hamish Karamanli, who should be the Pasha, kind of living in exile. And what William Eaton says, if we go help Hamish out, help him chase his brother out of Tripoli, we'll have a friend, and they'll stop messing with our ships. And so that's what they try and do. They're going to support him with the Navy, with naval gunfire. They land a young Marine officer by the name of Presley O'Bannon and 8 Marines. That's a giant task force, isn't it? 8 Marines and a lieutenant, and they're going to go help, along with Mr. Eaton, they're going to go help Hamish Karamanli organize his men, and they're going to attack the city of Derna, the fortified city of Derna, in April of 1805, also using gunfire from the Naval Task Force. And they're going to capture the citadel. They're going to chase away the Pasha's troops. There'll be a counterattack. And a lot of the people that helped capture Derna are going to want to run, but the Marines convince them that that's not what to do, and they stay and they fight off the counterattack. And then they're getting ready to go and attack Tripoli, when an American diplomat, kind of a useless person who's hung around ever since Washington was president, named Tobias Lear, convinces them, now we can negotiate with the Pasha of Tripoli. We don't have to go any further with the fighting. We could have knocked him off the throne, but Tobias Lear runs over and makes a deal with him. And he promises to be a good boy and not attack our ships. We kind of betray the guy that helped us take Derna because we promised to help him get back on the throne. Young Marine lieutenant gets a sword from Hamish Karamanli. It's covered with precious stones. The hilt of the sword is covered with gems. And of course he's an honest man, and you're not allowed to take gifts from a foreign government. So he turns it over to the government, and it goes to some place. I'm not sure the Smithsonian was there yet. It goes to some repository in Washington, D.C., and someone steals all of the gemstones off of it. Good old Washington, D.C. There were even thieves there then, not to mention now. I think the sword's in the Smithsonian, but it doesn't have the gemstones on it anymore. The reason I put it up there on that slide is that hilt is different from the hilts of all the swords of all our military. And it's used only by officers of the United States Marine Corps. It's called the Mamluk hilt. And to this day they use it. I have one hanging on my wall in my house. I've never had a sword fight with it, but at one point I had to wear it for official functions. Okay. Other problems we're going to have. Let's talk about Louisiana. We'll talk about Indians in a while. We'll go back and talk about that. Napoleon was in charge of France. He forced the Spanish to give him the Louisiana Territory, including New Orleans. He never really moved into New Orleans, but in theory he owned it. In 1802, he's going to send more than 20,000 soldiers over to the island of Haiti to overthrow that insurrection by the slaves. He won't succeed. His soldiers will catch yellow fever, and the whole fleet's going to go home. But Americans are wondering, the president was wondering, his advisors were wondering, why did he send 20,000 seasoned soldiers under a good general for a little uprising? And they got to thinking, that's because he was planning on finishing that uprising and then moving into New Orleans. And the president got very uncomfortable about that, and he told his ambassador, Mr. Livingston, I want you to go to Napoleon, and I want you to offer him, well, let's say up to $13 or $14 million to sell us New Orleans. We don't want the French sitting at the gateway to the Mississippi River. Livingston can't get to see him. So Jefferson sends former American ambassador to France, James Monroe, over there to help Livingston. Monroe was very popular with the French. And the long and short of it is, Napoleon says, I'm busy with other things. Here, take it all. $15 million, I need some money. $15 million, I'll sell you the whole Louisiana Territory. What a bargain. Now, Jefferson's conflicted. Why? He really wants that land. But on the other hand, he's an anti-federalist, and they don't believe in the president doing things that he doesn't have the official power to do. But enough of his friends convince him it's a good idea, get that land. It's a bargain. The Tertium Quid, his own Democratic Republican party or group, faction, they say, what are you doing? You can't do that. You're not allowed to do that under the Constitution. The Essex Junto, those hardline Federalists, say the same thing. They've got a different reason. They don't want them to get all this Western territory because they don't want our population to move west because they need workers for their factories and things like that, and they don't want them to go away. So what Jefferson has to do when he finally decides to go through with it is he has to get enough of the people from the Democratic Republican faction that are more moderate and enough of the people from the Federalist faction who are more moderate and put together a little coalition that gives him enough votes to approve the money to authorize him to buy the Louisiana Territory. And he does that, in the spring of 1803, and it's formalized at the end of the year. $15 million for everything from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. Now, you should think about this. I know we're running short on time. What did we really buy? There wasn't anybody living up there. Basically, what we were buying was exclusivity. We had the exclusive right to try and take that land away from the Indians. Nobody had surveyed it or anything like that. All we were doing is, now the French won't mess with it, the Spanish won't mess with it, it's up to us. It's a funny thing because you're seeing a Democratic Republican behaving and interpreting the Constitution the way a Federalist would interpret it. And you're seeing Federalists opposing it. Those are politicians, right? Flip-flop. Whenever it's something you don't like, you can change your ideals on a moment's notice. We'll talk about some other issues when we start up next time. But I will tell you about this territory. Very quickly, he's going to send an expedition that's going to go across this territory, over the Rocky Mountains, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to collect scientific data, flora, fauna, plant life, animal life, observe the people that lived out there, see who was hostile, who was friendly, see what land could be used for agriculture, see what kind of route you could follow to get out to the west. They're going to go up the Missouri River, remember that, the Missouri River, all the way to the Rockies almost. On the other side of the mountains, they're going to go down the Columbia River. Along the way, about halfway out, before they get to the Rockies anyway, they're going to hire a French trapper to be a translator for them. And the trapper comes with a wife, ever so slightly pregnant, and her name is Sacagawea. And although her husband does most of the interpretation for them, she acts as sort of an ambassador for them, so that when they bump into different Indian groups, she explains to them that these men mean no harm and they're just looking. And actually bumps into some of her family because she was a slave. She'd been captured from her own Shoshone tribe many years before, and on the way up the Rockies, up to the foothills, she bumps into her home tribe again. They couldn't understand what she was doing because she ran out in front of everybody and started doing some kind of funny dance, and they thought maybe she'd lost it. And what it was is she'd seen her brother. But anyway, they made it all the way over the mountains. They set their feet in the Pacific Ocean and came back and reported on it in great detail. And the president had sent out two other groups. One was run by Zebulon Pike. He's going to go further south. We'll talk about that when we meet next time. And the other one was an expedition, I don't even know the leader, who was looking for the source of the Red River. Very interested in Western lands. Okay, we'll start up that next time. You guys be prepared to remind me where we're starting. Yes, you have a question. What's your question? About the quiz. That was due on Monday that you didn't turn in. Okay.
No, I turned it in.
Oh, you did turn it in.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
There's a question on there that could have
Two answers?
and I chose the more correct one, I thought.
And it said you're wrong?
Yeah.
What's the question?
During the drafting of the Constitution, a compromise known as the Three-Fifths Compromise was negotiated concerning the inclusion of slave population. Slave voting was not specifically mentioned. For the process of what? Collection of tax, opportunement of representation.
Apportionment.
Yeah, apportionment of representation.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Okay, it had nothing to do with voting rights.
No, nothing to do with voting rights, nothing to do with emancipation. So it's either collection tax or opportunity of representation. And in the regions, it says both.
Okay, I'll give you credit for either one. It wasn't really intended about the tax, that was a secondary thing.
Okay, because in the regions, it says for taxation and representation.
Yeah, you're right.
So,
Yeah, you're right.
okay, thank you.
Good point, too. Next time, ladies and gentlemen, we'll meet again. And, Hale Center, take a look at those recordings that I put up for you. And post if you missed a class, you do the same.
Have a good day.
You do the same.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.